Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you all for coming and caring about the state of democracy in the world and in the United States, because it's no joke. It's not in good shape. I have been basically studying this issue for nearly 40 years now, since I entered doctoral studies and basically wrote a doctoral thesis engaging the kinds of issues I'm going to talk to you about today. And I will say, actually, I have never been more worried about the state of democracy in the world, frankly, and in the United States than I am right now. And I think you can imagine some of the reasons why, but I will add to them and hopefully not alarm you too much. I should say I am no longer director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. I stepped down a year ago and was succeeded by a remarkable colleague, Francis Fukuyama. But I remain very involved with the center and, of course, with the Haas Center for Public Service, as some of you know. I am going to go through a large number of slides in a mercilessly rapid fashion. I apologize for that, but I want to give you a very broad overview, a taste of what I have given my students this quarter in the class I teach every so often on comparative democratic development. I'll be happy to send these slides to anybody who wants them, or maybe Stanford can make them available. And I have very ambitious plans to do a new generation of sharing this knowledge globally. I've taught this type of subject twice as a massive open online course, and the interest in it globally is quite striking and I think very heartening. And that's one of the optimistic currents about what's out there in the world, that I think if you look at the developing world, there's still a strong demand for democracy, maybe even greater than what we're seeing as a retreat in some of the advanced industrial democracies. Let me say I look at democracy in the world at two levels: the kind of basic level of electoral democracy. Can people choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections? And then the higher quality of liberal democracy with a strong rule of law, strong mechanisms to control corruption and abuse of power, and very extensive protection for the rights of individuals, of groups, of minorities, and so on. And we could go into this in greater detail, but just think of democracy for now as a basic level of electoral democracy, which may still allow for a lot of abuse of individual rights and a weak rule of law and very extensive corruption, and a higher threshold of liberal democracy. Then if you look at what's happened to democracy since the great wave of democratic expansion, what we call the third wave of global democratization, began in 1974, you see this slide that I've been maintaining for maybe 20 years now. And basically you see that the minimal level of electoral democracy, when this wave began in 1974, there were only barely a quarter of all the independent states in the world that could be said to choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. That expanded very gradually in the 1980s until the big burst in the late 1980s. We didn't even fully realize we were living through a great wave of democratic expansion in the world. When the Cold War ended in 1991, for the first time in the history of the world, a majority of all the independent states of the world were living in electoral democracies. And that's remained the case since. But you can see that there's been a leveling off in recent years and not much progress. And then if you measure the liberal democracies of the world, a subset of all the electoral democracies, you see that the expansion has been more moderate and has just kind of flattened. And the inflection point in everything I'm showing you is around 2006. And you can ask the question, you can start thinking about it now while I keep talking, why 2005, 2006, 2007, everything starts turning downward into a democratic funk that has been persistent as a kind of slow, mild recession for the last decade. And my point is, I don't think it's slow and mild anymore, and I'll explain why. We're in a situation where we see a growing kind of separation between small countries and large countries. Very small countries with less than 1 million population tend to be much more democratic. As you can see here at the end of last year, 90% of them were electoral democracies, only 54% of the bigger countries, and a huge distinction in terms of liberal democracy. More than 2/3 of all the tiny island and other small countries in the world are liberal democracies, but only 1/3 of the larger states. And so if you look at the trend of even moderately big countries, that is any country over 1 million population, you really see this inflection point at the end, beginning in 2006, where democratic progress just stops, and you see this kind of what looks like nothing alarming, just a kind of stagnation, a slight decline. We're at a point now that on the surface still looks pretty good. This is the story of the third wave of global democratization, that you now have a critical mass of democracies in every region of the world except the Middle East. And, nearly half of the countries in Asia, 2/3 of the former communist countries, virtually 9 and 10 of all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and over 1/3 of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are electoral democracies, and even some liberal democracies in each of these developing regions, again, except for the Middle East and North Africa. And there, at least, we have the first Arab democracy that we've had in 4 decades, namely in Tunisia. But since about 2006, we've been entering or living in a period of democratic recession. And these are the reasons why I claim empirically that we've been in a 10-year-long period of democratic stagnation, mild recession, or something else that I believe now is gathering alarming momentum. First of all, we peaked in the number of democracies in the world and in the percentage of independent states in the world that are democracies around 2006. It's been kind of stagnation or slight decline since then. Second of all, I will tell you, as someone who struggles with some degree of agony to answer the question, which countries are democracies? It's not an easy judgment to make. I rely very heavily on the data of Freedom House, the organization in New York that evaluates levels of freedom, political rights, and civil liberties in every country in the world every year, and also their judgments about which countries are democracies. But some of these, quote, democracies have very disturbing scores, particularly on civil liberties and even political rights. They have a 1 to 7 scale. Every year they rate every country in the world. The data's on the website. You can go to it, just Google freedom in the world, and you'll see 1 is the most free, 7 is the least free. Well, if you've got countries that are only at the midpoint of 4 on these measures, how democratic can they be? And if they've got a 5, I just throw them out of the list of democracies, even if Freedom House claims otherwise. Secondly, we're now into the 10th year, the 10th consecutive year in which the number of countries that have gained each year in democracy have been exceeded by the number of countries that have declined in their level of political rights or civil liberties or both. So here is the line of stability or equity at 1. That is, if a year is at 1, it means as many countries are declining as are gaining in their level of freedom. But you can see here that between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and the year, including the year 2005, the balance was very healthy. In most years, more countries gained than declined in freedom. Sometimes more than twice as many. In one year, 3 times as many countries gained in freedom as declined. And only in really 1 year did it move in the reverse direction. Since 2006, in every single year, the balance has been negative. And in some cases, almost twice as many countries have declined in their freedom score as have gained. The third point is we've had a lot of slippages of democracy. And this can be hard to count because the really smart autocrats, the Putins, the Erdogans, and so on, the prime minister, now president of Turkey, they're not doing what Fujimori did in 1992 in Peru and saying to the world, I don't like democracy, it isn't working, I'm seizing emergency powers, I'm closing down the parliament, and I'll decide everything. They're a little bit more subtle about it. They just keep squeezing and squeezing political pluralism, media freedom, civil society space until there's none left, and they're totally in control. That's long since what's happened in Russia. Of course, a long time ago, Hugo Chavez did that in Venezuela while he was alive. Daniel Ortega didn't waste any time doing it when he came back to power in Nicaragua. It's what Erdogan has done in Turkey. And we've had, as a result of that and more conventional military coups and executive seizures of power, a lot of democratic reversals, about 27 or 28 since 2000 alone. And as a result, you see here that we have had a rising tide of democratic breakdowns. So if you break up this third wave of global democratization that began in 1974 into different decades, you can see we started the period with a high rate of democratic failure in the first decade. 16% of all the democracies that existed in that decade failed at some point during the decade. And then the failure rate declined to 8% in the next decade, and then it rose to 11%. And in the last 11 years, I tried to break it up as evenly as possible. During this 42-year period, the failure rate has climbed to 17%. The next bar on the right, 1974 to 2015, means that 38% of all the democracies that have existed during this period have failed. It's a pretty high failure rate. And if you take out the advanced industrial democracies and just look at the developing and post-communist world, it's 42% of all the democracies during this 4-decade period. Now you should be asking, I'm sure you are asking, why? And in order to answer the question why, I found it useful to do something a little bit social scientific and inventive with the Freedom House data. Embedded in the Freedom House data, and I know there's some lawyers and maybe human rights activists and professionals in the room, so you may appreciate this, or people who are concerned about corruption. I took out of the Freedom House scales, political rights and civil liberties, all the measures that have to do with the rule of law, accountability, transparency, and controlling corruption. So instead of having 2 scales, political rights, the right to contest and participate in free and fair multi-party elections, and civil liberties, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Now we have 3, including transparency and the rule of law. And this is what you see in region after region. First of all, of the 3 scales, civil liberties here, political rights, and transparency and the rule of law, you see this kind of pattern in most of the regions. Number 1, that the trend and level of transparency in the rule of law is the lowest of the 3 scales. This is the area where emerging and developing political systems in the world do the worst. And it's also seen in some ways the most visible decline during the 8-year period, or now nearly decade-long period, of what I argue has been a democratic recession. This is the data for sub-Saharan Africa, but the same pattern appears for Eastern Europe. Now, of course, Eastern Europe has higher levels. I've standardized all these scores 0 to 1. So this is, this is just showing the scale from 0.10 to 0.16, and here I've tried to show the separation better by just showing you the upper half of the scale. But the point is, the pattern is the same in each region. Countries and regions do worse on transparency and the rule of law than they do on the other two dimensions. And that tends to be one that you can see a more visible pattern of decline, whether you're looking at Eastern Europe, here the former Soviet Union, here Latin America, no change, but a much worse performance on transparency and the rule of law than on political rights or civil liberties. And again, the trend for Asia. Something's going on here, and it heavily speaks to what we have increasingly focused on in our Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is if you don't have an effective functioning state, and if you can't find ways to deliver a rule of law with a neutral, independent, and transparent process, and most of all, control corruption, it's going to be hard to sustain effective and just economic development. And I can tell you as a political scientist, and believe me, I learned this bitterly on the ground through my work on and teaching in Nigeria during some very difficult periods, it's going to be very hard to sustain democracy. So there's a hugely important relationship between controlling corruption and ensuring governance on the one hand, and enabling broadly distributed economic development and viable democracy on the other. That's probably the most important analytic point I have to make to you this evening. We've also seen, I won't go into the details, you can see it on the slide here, real slippage in democracy here in our own hemisphere, even though among developing regions of the world, Latin America is generally doing better than Africa, Asia, or certainly the post-Soviet states. And you all know what's happened with the Arab Spring. It's turned into an Arab freeze. Governance in Egypt is the worst it's been, in the modern day history of Egypt. You have a brutally, vindictively, viciously, and I think intolerably authoritarian state in Egypt now that the United States government simply can't find the words to challenge or criticize. It's a source of really deep regret for me, because I guarantee you this is not sustainable, and it's going to come crashing down in ways that are going to present far more serious security challenges for the United States in the coming decade. I'm going to skip this so I can get to some of the other points I want to make. We are now living in a new era in two senses. One, we were seeing emerge in the last few years, and I'm going to take a few minutes to explain it to you. And the other we have been seeing emerge particularly visibly in the last year. And the combination of these two trends, I think, represents what I cannot yet document statistically, but I can tell you from a qualitative sense and an analytical sense, I think represents a new and dangerous convergence in the world that we must address as a collectivity of democracies in the world, as a set of civil societies in the world, in our foreign policy with our democratic allies, or years down the road, we won't be talking about a democratic recession in the world. We'll be talking about something far deeper and more dangerous. The first element is the resilience of a lot of authoritarian regimes, which have a newfound self-confidence, outward propellant energy, and increasing authoritarian control over their own societies. Just in the last week, China's ruler, Xi Jinping, has sent out instructions that our colleagues, political science professors in China, are now to review the undergraduate and graduate theses of their students to ensure that there is no ideological contamination, presumably from people like myself, and that not only that their papers are free of dangerous Western ideas, but to ensure that they are positively reflecting the neo-Maoist ideological doctrine that the Chinese Communist Party is now pushing out in a very aggressive way, and in a very sophisticated way, by the way, using social media as well as more conventional media, just in the last week. And Russia has just taken another step, as China has, toward declaring any form of assistance to non-governmental organizations from Western organizations to be essentially a criminal offense liable to prosecution, particularly from, of course, the organization that I've had some association with and publishes the journal I've been editing for 25 years, the Journal of Democracy, and that is the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. But more than this, as we, my colleagues at the Journal of Democracy, and I have documented in a book we've just produced called Authoritarianism Goes Global, they're not content with simply deepening authoritarian control in their own country, and they are pushing outward with new tools, new self-confidence, new resources, and a new generation of big lie propaganda that has them on a great arc of energy and momentum that, frankly, we are not countering. We're just not effectively countering. And that means that Russia and China and now Iran have international broadcasts that are seen in English language and in other foreign languages in a lot of countries around the world. Often they are, because I travel a lot, I watch TV a lot when I travel a lot, they're much higher up on the list of channels in some of these countries than CNN or the BBC or something that would give people, in my opinion, a more neutral view of what's happening in the world. There's a club of authoritarian regimes in the world called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which these authoritarian regimes, the ones you see here, the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, and some others, are now cooperating. They're sharing their technologies of internet surveillance, filtration, and suppression. They're sharing their legal tools for criminalizing the flow of cross-border assistance to non-governmental organizations and independent media. And in the case of Russia, with its invasion of Crimea and Ukraine, in the case of Chinese power projection in the South China Sea, they're beginning to become militarily more assertive or even aggressive. There are very few things that worry me, thinking strategically. I will say this parenthetically, but something of this weight can never be a parenthetical comment. There are very few things that worry me more strategically in terms of our own national security than the buildup of Chinese military power converging with the new generation of nationalist doctrination and propaganda that are being fed to Chinese young people. I know this not only because of what I read and study, but because our students are studying at the Beijing campus at Peking University, and they are seeing this, and they are encountering this among their Chinese peers to a degree that we have not seen before. And the potential for this to spiral downward under an American national elected leadership that is not prudent, that is not careful, that is not vigilant and that is not wise into some sort of military confrontation that neither side would want or could afford, I think is vastly underestimated and is the single greatest danger to our security and well-being, in my opinion, exceeding Islamic terrorism. You can see what's going on in terms of the authoritarian resurgence. Now, I want to add an extension of the point I made, that the democracies of the world are not doing well. And part of that is the fact not only that we've had a lot of democratic failures in the world, but that many, many, many of the prominent and not so prominent democracies of the world, the developing and post-communist world, are either performing poorly or visibly declining in their quality of governance and in their stability. This is happening, I think, in an alarming way these days in South Africa. It is happening in ways that are subtle and not so subtle with the recently elected Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who's starting to squeeze civil society in India and give more and more scope to Hindu nationalist and religious extremist forces in India. You know what's going on in Brazil with the massive corruption scandal involving their state oil company Petrobras and the recent Senate vote to remove the president from power, with the likelihood that she'll be permanently removed as a result of conviction in this scandal. I've got 4 pictures here of emerging autocratic personalities that I think threaten democracy. 2 of them didn't make it in the conversion of the slides. Let me say, but I will say something about the individuals, each of them. You have a president in South Africa now, Jacob Zuma, who has had nothing but contempt for rule of law and control of corruption. I mean, he thinks it's a joke that people are concerned that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of state money to embellish and aggrandize his own personal property. But everyone who looks at South Africa sees a declining quality of governance and declining levels of vigilance and concern about corruption. There is a very good chance, most observers believe a better than even chance, that the daughter of the Peruvian dictator, who's now in jail, but may not be for very much longer, Keiko Fujimori, will win the presidential runoff election in Peru at the beginning of June. She was leading in the first round. The Philippines has just elected as its president Rodi Duterte, an individual who made a colossal joke out of an Australian woman being gang raped and murdered some decades ago, who has promised to round up drug traffickers and shoot them and throw them into the sea, and who has gently indicated that if the Philippine Congress should get in the way, he'll be glad to close it down and simply seize total power. I have learned as a political scientist, who first of all spent a number of years teaching the case of the breakdown of the Weimar Republic in Germany and the rise of the Nazis, and then studying democratic breakdowns elsewhere in the world, to take seriously what people say they might do when they're running for national leadership. Finally, yeah, you understood all the dimensions of... And finally, not finally, but finally for this slide, you may know that Hungary has, for a number of years now, a Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who's an open admirer of Putin and has basically been borrowing from his playbook to squeeze civil society, to pack the constitutional court in Hungary, and to increasingly take over all the independent levers of checks and balances and controls, so that many Hungarians believe, I as a political scientist would now argue, that this member state of the European Union, which body requires all of its members to be democracies, is in fact no longer not merely a liberal democracy, not a democracy, period. And then we come to this gentleman, who I think has rapidly emerged as a poster child for the diffusion of the Putin model and character of death to democracy by 1,000 cuts, because he's been doing it over a 12-year period in Turkey now. First, for a long time as prime minister, now he's assumed the presidency and is simply determined to convert Turkey into formally a presidential system so he can concentrate as much personal power in himself as possible. The message came home to me in a very visceral way when I was in Turkey at the time of its local elections for a conference that our Stanford students did there with a partner organization at Koç University, where we have an overseas campus that, oh, by the way, I think is increasingly unviable because of what's happening in Turkey. And you can read these words here. And these words were not addressed to terrorists, really, but simply to people who were calling out the corruption of his government, the fact that Erdogan and other ministers had sons for which there was obvious evidence of insider dealing on contracts and so on. For him, that is revealing state secrets. And for him, those people in the media, in civil society, deserve what he called a full Ottoman slap. And the full dimensions of that slap involve people being arrested, newspapers being closed down or bought up, and my colleagues in academia increasingly fearful of whatever they say or do, that they may be fired or prosecuted. Why is democracy in danger today? Well, these are the 5 reasons that I think come together. A weak and deteriorating rule of law, extensive corruption, weak and weakening institutions to contain it, that therefore allows these abusive presidents to acquire and aggrandize power. Often severe polarization around ethnic, religious, class, or identity lines, weak and ineffective parties, and systems of horizontal accountability, judiciaries, independent legislatures, counter-corruption commissions, human rights commissions that might contain this, and poor economic performance. Now, let me say that if you look at the circumstances in which democracy has clearly failed, poor economic performance, economic crisis is not the leading reason. Many democracies fail when the economy looks like it's doing okay, or even well, but they fail amid corruption, bad governance, poor distribution of the economic growth, and something else that's been happening in the last 8 years or so that helps us understand why that inflection point and the acceleration of this democratic recession, perhaps, in the post-2008 period, that we've been through a very severe global economic recession. We are going through continuing economic turbulence. We are in a period of, for the last maybe 50 to 100 years, extraordinary and even unprecedented acceleration of economic inequality. And a lot of people in a lot of places, particularly now the advanced industrial democracies, including the United States, feel that they are economically insecure, that their kids will be doing worse than they were privileged to do, that they are experiencing downward mobility in their income, wealth, and status. And if you look at the social and economic circumstances that have given rise over time, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, to xenophobic, authoritarian, right-wing populism, the social base of it, the social stuff of it, was individuals who felt that their status was threatened and declining. Look at the support base for Viktor Orban, for Putin, for the man who is likely to be elected president of Austria in the next few days, Norbert Hofer, who has a kind of neo-Nazi element to his appeal and certainly fits in the model of these extreme right-wing, authoritarian, anti-immigrant, xenophobic populists who are playing on people's fears. And you see this pattern in country after country after country. So, to conclude, I am not despairing of the future of democracy. I think people want to be free. I also can show you with a lot of statistical data that there are many instances when these people don't have a majority. There's no runoff election in the Philippines. So this guy who ruled Mindanao in the Philippines as governor for some 2 decades with such an iron and demonstrably authoritarian hand, ultimately won with something like 40% of the vote. He might have lost a runoff, and that can be said about maybe elections within political parties as well, where individuals who may have some of these xenophobic, bigoted, and authoritarian tendencies may be able to capture the nomination of their parties with something well less than majority support simply because of fragmentation. The points I want to make in conclusion are these. Number one, I worry that as a political scientist, we are potentially at a tipping point in the world where a long period of not so good performance, a lot of slippage, a lot of funk, a lot of skepticism gathering about democracy, people not doing well, democracy's not performing well, at a minimum stagnation, slight recession of freedom and democracy in the world may tip and sharply and even rapidly into something far more serious. I think democracy, Turkey is not a democracy any longer. I don't think Hungary is. And Poland has just elected a far-right nationalist government as well. And if Europe doesn't stand up to this, if the United States doesn't stand up to this, if the alliance, if there is still one, of liberal democracies in the world don't find ways culturally and politically and symbolically and through their use of soft and not so soft power resources, I'm not talking about military here, but economic, this could spiral into something far worse. And finally, people watch what we do. I travel all over the world. And for many years, when I give lectures about democracy in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and elsewhere, inevitably people ask me about, well, what's going on in your own country? Campaign finance, political polarization, shutdowns of Congress. There is nothing that we can do to respond to and try and push back against this possibly gathering trend of democratic deterioration in the world that is more urgently important and potentially more powerful than repairing and reviving our own democracy and possibly even defending our own democracy. I will say finally, I hope this is not too provocative, but honestly, I am so concerned about what is happening in the world, and I'll just be blunt with you about what is happening in the United States, that I increasingly feel compelled to walk right up to the edge of the imperative, I think, that we all in academia must respect of avoiding partisan statements and partisan affiliations. So I will simply put it this way. choosing my words as carefully as possible. Many of the wisest people who have reflected on the failure of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism and the rise of something far worse than authoritarianism have recognized that the most insidious thing in the rise of authoritarianism has been the abandonment of ethical compass and conviction among people who knew better and fell into line for practical reasons. And I can tell you that the single most famous, really infamous, but indispensable words that were uttered when Hitler entered power were those by some of the conventional conservative parties in Germany who, having run out of steam, having failed to form a conventional government, finally threw in the towel and agreed to the nomination of Hitler to be Chancellor of Germany in 1933, after, by the way, his electoral support had declined slightly in the recent election, and at a time when the Nazis had never won even 40% of the vote, but said, well, now we have Hitler exactly where we want him, that is in the chancellorship, the prime ministership, now we can control him. Thank you very much. Okay, after that, does anyone have any questions? Over there. And I think we're going to try and get you mics, but this will be filmed. People will want to hear it, so just speak up.
The status of Pakistan.
Huh?
What is the current status in north of Korea or down in Pakistan?
Okay, well, in North Korea, you have a ruler, Kim Jong-un, who I think is a very dangerous figure. You know, sometimes when you're young and you're a totalitarian leader, you don't even have that kind of leavening of judgment that can come from having lived in the geopolitics of a region for a longer period of time. So I think he is a very provocative and dangerous ruler who's been tightening control within his own country, and as you know, continuing the desperate bid not only for North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but for North Korea to have the ability to deliver these weapons by ballistic missile. And they're still apparently years away from the ability to do so credibly, but they're clearly seeking it. And look, this is the last totalitarian regime in the world with levels of control, concentration camps for anyone who is even vaguely related to someone who's represented a threat of dissidence or just displeasing the absolute ruler. It's a horrible regime and a dangerous regime. In Pakistan, you at least have a quasi-democratic system, not a great leader, but someone who I think has, you know, more or less respected democratic conventions and rules. But Pakistan urgently needs better governance, a higher quality of governance, more effective control of corruption. And part of the problem in Pakistan is that every time you get an elected government, a few years later, the military comes back to power. And a political system a multi-party system can't mature if every few years it's being displaced by an authoritarian regime. So we really need to work very hard to ensure that governance gradually improves in Pakistan and also that the military doesn't come back to power.
If you were president, what do we have in our toolbox, statecraft, would you use to try to stop the polarization and the authoritarian governments that you are fearful of?
Well, on the global front, I think that we really need to do a number of things. First of all, I think we need to push back diplomatically in a more assertive way. it doesn't mean that we can always make democracy at the forefront of our foreign policy. I'm not saying that we should walk away from every authoritarian ally because it's authoritarian. But when you see a regime sliding into the political abyss with the energy and blindness that is happening now in Egypt, to go there as Secretary Kerry has and say nothing about that, I think is a tragic, at a minimum, waste of an opportunity and, frankly, of an abandonment of a responsibility to our own national security. Forget about the meaning in terms of human rights and what's happening to Egyptian society. So I think we need a more forward-leaning foreign policy in that sense. I think we've got to rally our democratic allies in Latin America through the OAS and particularly through the European Alliance to push back more on this. We've got to speak out about what's happening, I think, very frankly, in Hungary and Poland and so on. These are countries that are part of, in theory, a European democratic alliance. And I think that besieged Democrats in those countries really want us to say things. You know, a lot can be done just by posturing, just by language, just by making clear our views. And I think we need much more funding again for democracy assistance programs through the U.S. Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy, though the latter's budget has been increasing, not because the Obama administration has been recommending it, although it hasn't been unfriendly to it. Interestingly, the Congress has been doing it. I'll just say finally, because I've got a long list, I have an article coming out in Foreign Affairs probably in the next 2 weeks that speaks to this. So if you keep your eye on the Foreign Affairs website, you'll see the longer list. But I have really become convinced that working on the informational front, the cultural front, is extremely important. And I think we need to re-energize the voice of America, not as propaganda, but as neutral information. We need to put more resources into enabling people to circumvent internet censorship and filtration. And we need to make democratic knowledge and ideas more available around the world. And that's mainly what I intend to focus on in the next few years. Yeah?
Can I just, maybe just follow on your last point? I have two questions. The first is, how much do you feel that this erosion is a function of anti-U.S. sentiment and resistance against? And then the second question is, what is the status of social unrest and injustice generally as a deterrent against these trends?
So I don't think that anti-U.S.
Question, please. Can you use the microphone?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I was wondering how much of the erosion is a function of anti-U.S. sentiment more than anything? And secondly, what is the status of social unrest as a deterrent against some of these trends? Is there underpinnings of unrest that may in fact serve to reverse some of this erosion?
So I don't think anti-U.S. sentiment has been a leading element of this. I think that the erosion has more to do with bad governance within these countries and the exploitation of opportunities by, the normal range of leaders in the world, many of whom, of course, would always like to have more power, more wealth. And once you start sliding down that road, it's just kind of human nature, historically over time, that ambitions expand with the opportunities. But I do worry about this. If we have a government that has been openly contemptuous of our neighbors and talks about building walls to keep them out, if we have a government that is threatening to launch trade wars with other countries, if we have a government that is, frankly, pretty blatantly ethnocentric in its attitudes toward peoples around the world who don't look like, many Americans, or who practice a different religion than the majority of Americans do, how do you think the rest of the world is going to view us? This is a reciprocal phenomenon here. And then secondly, in terms of social unrest or social justice, well, a lot of this is being driven, I want to repeat, by the trends of increasing inequality in the world and the sense that people are being treated unfairly. Now, when people feel that they're blocked in their ambitions for economic progress or that their status is declining, they tend to turn in a populist direction. And that's either going to be to the right or the left. For a long time in Latin America, it's been to the left, to Hugo Chavez and others like Correa in Ecuador and Ortega and so on. I don't see a sign outside of Peru of a big wave of this right-wing populism in Latin America, but who knows? I do see the danger of a wave of right-wing populism in lots of other places in the world, in Asia, in Europe, and so on. Okay, right here.
So you touched on the role of the post-2008 depression of creating conditions, or exacerbating conditions, income inequality. But I'm wondering to what extent you feel that this erosion in democracy worldwide is a consequence of the U.S. foreign policy focus on the Middle East.
Okay, the question is, to what extent is the worldwide erosion a consequence of U.S. policy in the Middle East? Well, is it a coincidence that the democratic recession appears to have begun as the fallout from the Iraq invasion was really kind of consolidating into the disaster that Iraq became? Personally, I don't think it was a coincidence. I think that there has been a global reaction and a U.S. reaction against the association in many people's minds of democracy promotion with military imposition. And to that extent, I think that U.S. policy in the Middle East has played a role. I think U.S. policy in Iraq has played a role. It soured a lot of Americans. You can't even mention the word democracy promotion now. You'll probably see all candidates running away from it. They will use other terms because in people's minds you say democracy promotion and they see American tanks rolling into Iraq. So we have a lot of work to do to recover the word, the legitimacy of the activity as not the use of military force, but of peaceful solidarity with Democrats in these countries to give them resources, technology, financial support, simply solidarity, advice to help them develop democracy in their own countries by their own initiative and their own vision. And this is why I think that democracy and governance assistance through peaceful means with a lot of techniques we've refined, as well as the energizing of our information and hopefully social media efforts is so important. Over here?
Do you think the rise of China as a major world power has something to do with other nations trying to emulate its form of governance or lack thereof?
Well, I think China's rise as a world power is mainly due to its extraordinary economic dynamism in the last 4 decades. No country in the history of the world has grown economically as rapidly and has developed its economy, physical infrastructure, and middle class as vigorously as China has in the last 4 decades. So the result of that is, first of all, it's got the second biggest economy in the world. It's got a lot of economic and financial resources. It's now reaching out with very generous and significant aid programs in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on, much larger than our own in most cases. So it's got more soft power, much more than it had before. It's got more sophistication to its media efforts. But I think it all begins with the extraordinary economic development performance of China. Over here.
What are the main factors that foster political corruption? And once a government is politically corrupt, what can be done to rein that in?
So the main, I'll mention two big factors that I think foster corruption. The generic one, opportunity. Because throughout human history, I'm sorry, I begin my class by talking about the game Monopoly. What's the goal of the board game Monopoly? It's to own everything. And you look at human nature, you look at human societies, you read the story of political development over thousands of years that my colleague Frank Fukuyama has traced in his remarkable 2-volume work on political order. And you see, kind of, that's the default position, I'm very sorry, of domination. I got to use the word not in a Marxist sense, just in a political science one, exploitation and control. Get as much wealth and power as you can. And it's constitutions and the rule of law and independent judiciaries and ultimately democracy, but not just electoral democracy. All of this architecture of liberal democracy that controls this. And this is why I put so much emphasis on having a good democracy, a liberal democracy, with a strong independent judiciary, strong constitutional court, freedom of information laws, independent counter-corruption commission, independent auditors, and so on, so that these things can be controlled and people who might have a weakness toward the natural human tendency to take advantage will be constrained from doing so by strong institutions. It's no accident that once a Putin or an Erdogan or a Chavez or an Orban starts getting a grip on things and gathering momentum and feeling like they have power, the first thing they do, always the first thing they do, is go after the judiciary and try and compromise its independence and pack the constitutional court. Then they have a free ride to destroy the rest of judicial independence and the other independent institutions. And then they go after civil society and the independent media, and then there isn't much left. The second factor that I do want to note is the resource curse. When you've got oil wealth, natural resource wealth, falling out of the sky, not coming from people's taxes, it just tends to get ripped off and disappear from the orbit of accountability and transparency. And if you're not careful, as a donor country or whatever else, independent foundations, World Bank, providing this aid in the developing world, to have accountability, to have a concern about the quality of governance in a country, to demand clear oversight of aid projects, and you just pour money into the general budget of the randomly chosen developing country with bad governance, then aid functions like oil. It's just another source of rents, and it's likely to be ripped off and used by the elites for their own power enhancement and luxury enjoyment.